Thanks, Chris. Normally when I'm speaking on ocean acidification, I'm following a NOAA scientist or someone who can do all the formulas for you and help you understand the chemistry and science behind it. I'll try to do my best with that today since don't have that luxury today. I'll talk about the impacts that we're seeing as an industry, what we're doing in response to that, and then share some photos just in generally about the industry so you sort of see what's in jeopardy here if we can't address this problem. So what is ocean acidification? Well, it occurs, again, as I just said, carbon dioxide, as we emit carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, the majority of that is absorbed by the atmosphere and results in the climate change effects that we're seeing, but about 25% of it is absorbed by the ocean. They used to think that was a good thing because what was being absorbed by the ocean wasn't affecting the climate. Well, they've come to realize that as you add CO2 to water, it changes the pH of the water and changes the chemistry in ways that affect things in not such a good way. So it creates an acid when that happens, and it lowers the pH, and critically for us, it reduces the amount of carbonate ions in the water, which are the building blocks of the shells of the animals that we grow, and building blocks for a lot of other calcifiers in the ocean as well. So this is a graph here to show the best time series they've got to demonstrate this phenomenon. So this is Mauna Loa and Station Aloha, and you can see the red is the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere climbing from 1989 to 2009, and then the blue is the CO2 levels in seawater increasing over that same period of time. So just in this past year, I think our atmospheric CO2 has crossed the 400 lines. So it continues to go, and as that has happened, they've also tracked the pH in the water, and you can see the trends in the pH as it declines over that same time period. So what that's done to the ocean chemistry is, since essentially the beginning of our industrial era and the CO2 that we've emitted, it has increased the acidity of the ocean about 30%. So pretty dramatic change. You don't realize that, if you look at the pH scale on the left, it's logarithmic. So it doesn't look, if you think you go from 8.2 to 8.1, that's not that big a change. But because it's a logarithmic scale, it actually is a huge change. And during that same period of time, the availability of carbonate ions has decreased by 16%. So again, those are the building blocks for calcifying organisms like clams, oysters, and mussels. And then what they predict will happen between now and 2100 is, on the current trends, is that acidity is going to increase 100 to 150%. And the carbonate ion concentration is going to decrease by 50%. So quite a dramatic change. The rate of change, as you can see by these curves, is changing much more dramatically in the years ahead. So on the West Coast here, we're sort of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, on this issue. So just the nature of the way the Pacific Ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, and then the way we get the deep ocean waters upwelling on the West Coast. So when we get north winds, it pushes the surface waters offshore, and the deep ocean waters come up off our coast and move into our estuaries, and that deep ocean water is where this carbon dioxide is sitting, and where that low pH water, high CO2 water is sitting and comes up into our estuaries. So this is a vertical cross-section off of St. George in Northern California, and just an example of one of these upwelling events from 2007, where you can see the continental shelf here and pH of 7.6. Normally seawater is around 8.1, 8.2 for a pH, and here you can see this pH of 7.6 coming right up to the surface, and then it would be coming into our estuaries here. More significantly for the shellfish growers is the aragonite saturation level. So that's essentially an indication of the amount of carbonate ions in the water. And if that number is above 1, you can build shell. If it's below 1, your shells are dissolving. So you can see here how the saturation state is 0.8, so below 1. So in this water, shells are dissolving, and here that low aragonite saturation water has come to the surface of our estuaries. So in that situation, we can't grow baby oysters. So it's not just calcifiers that are affected. There's a lot of other impacts as ocean acidification gets researched. And I'm not going to read down through the list, but beyond just calcification rates, which is at the top, these are all sorts of different effects that they're finding through research is occurring as we're increasing the CO2 levels and decreasing the pH in our ocean water. So a lot of other organisms that are affected. Oysters, we get called to speak on it because we're one of the first industries that's been directly impacted. A lot of the, oysters are fortunate that people like to eat them, and they have spokesmen like me to come out and talk about the impacts. A lot of the organisms that are actually being affected in the ocean just don't have spokesmen because they're further down in the food chain. We don't eat them directly, but things that we like to eat rely on them for food. So, a lot of these different plankton species that are at the bottom of the food chain that are being consumed to work their way up into bigger organisms that we eat are the ones that are being impacted by ocean acidification or potentially being impacted by ocean acidification. So just kind of in summary here, about 25% of the CO2 generated by humans since the mid-1700s has been absorbed by the oceans. That's increased the acidity of the ocean about 30% since the start of the industrial age. It's projected to increase by another 100 to 150% by 2100. And also the current rate of acidification is nearly 10 times faster than any period over the last 50 million years. So this is really significant. I mean, this has happened before, and when it happened, there was mass extinction at that time in the world. But what's happening now is faster. The rate of change is so dramatic. The big concern is that many of the organisms are not going to be able to adapt. Some of them are showing an incredible ability to adapt and evolve with these new seawater chemistries, but a lot of them will not be able to do that. So we're going to see in our lifetime, from my understanding of the science and all of the presentations I've been to on this, we're going to see a very different ocean. In the decades ahead, it's going to be a very dramatically different ocean than we know. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the shellfish industry now. On the West Coast, we've got shellfish farms from Alaska to California. Washington State dominates West Coast shellfish production, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. Most of the industry is made up by family farms. Taylor Shellfish, the company that I work for, is a family farm, but sort of an exception because they've become a big family farm. So they started growing shellfish in southern Puget Sound in 1890, and it's really just been in the last couple of decades that the family, the fourth generation that I work for, has really grown the business and expanded our operations. We have over 500 employees now, farms throughout the Puget Sound, British Columbia, out on the Washington coast. We have a hatchery on the Hood Canal that produces seed, another hatchery over in Kona, Hawaii. We have a big nursery facility in Northern California in Humboldt Bay. We also have a couple of pearl farms down in Fiji as well. So, but still very much a family operation, but sort of an exception just because of the size of the company. The vast majority of the industry is mom and pop operations. We've got maybe a half a dozen medium-sized companies that maybe have 25 to 50 employees. So, very much a family-oriented industry, multi-generation in many cases. There's lots of fourth and fifth generation shellfish farming families. So there's just some numbers. As far as production, oysters sort of dominate the scene. Manila clams are next as far as pounds. Value-wise, in Washington State, it's about $270 million annually in economic activity that's created by the industry, and about 3,200 jobs, direct and indirect jobs in the industry. So Mason County, Pacific County, so southern part of Puget Sound and then southwest corner of the state, it's the #1 and #2 private employers. So pretty big deal in some parts of our state as far as employment goes. And you can see the different types of shellfish products that are produced. One of the reasons that Washington leads farm shellfish production is our ability to own our tidelands. So kind of unique, very unique to Washington State. If you want to have a shellfish farm in any other state besides Washington, you have to lease those tidelands from the state. The tidelands and the bedlands, the deep water lands, all belong to the state, and you have to lease from the state. Well, it's hard to get permits sometimes and money, loans from banks if you have a lease, because typically the leases are 5 or 10 years long, no guarantee that they're going to be renewed. So you go to the bank to borrow money to start a business on a lease that is indefinite. It's hard to get money sometimes. Well, what happened in Washington State is in the 1800s, we had a wild fishery for the native oyster. And just like a lot of wild fisheries typically do, it started to overfish the oysters and the resource was in steep decline. So the legislature, right after we became a state in 1890, some of the very first laws our state legislature passed were oyster laws. So they took all of the productive oyster beds in the state and made them oyster reserves, not for sale. And then they said they passed 2 additional laws, the Bush Act and the Callow Act, that allowed for the sale of tidelands into private ownership, specifically for the purpose of growing the native oyster. You had to sign an affidavit that the land was barren, and then you could buy it from the state. There was limitations on how much you could buy from the state, but then you could go to the reserves and buy seed off the state oyster reserves to plant on your farms, and that was the foundation of a very successful industry. We had up to 1,000 acres of oyster beds growing native oysters in the early 1900s as a result of those laws. Very successfully turned around a declining resource, which was then later impacted by pulp mill effluent. And so the resource went back into decline, but the industry, because of that private tideland ownership, became very strong environmentalists, some of the first environmentalists in the state. My predecessors took on the pulp mills. The oyster industry sued the pulp mills, and we were the reason for the original state, our Department of Ecology, I can't remember what it was called, before the Department of Ecology, but it came about because of our lawsuits on the pulp mills and the declining water quality from the pulp mills. And we actually had oystermen from Washington State back in Congress testifying on behalf of the Clean Water Act when the Clean Water Act was being established. We have a long time history of being water quality advocates because, unlike wild fisheries, when a bay gets polluted or a resource gets depleted, they just move to the next bay. In our case, we can't do that. Here's our farm, we own this land. If it's being impacted by degraded water quality, we're going to go fight to try to get that water quality back to preserve our farms. So it's done a couple of neat things. It's eliminated that, what they call the tragedy of the commons, which happens in wild fisheries when the resource belongs to no one protects that resource. By giving us that ownership of those tidelands, we've become very strong environmentalists trying to protect that water quality. So anyhow, this is just a map of Samish Bay. Chris mentioned that I have a clam farm of my own besides working for Taylor's. This sandbar right here is my own clam farm out there in Samish Bay. So around 2005, we started to have problems producing oyster seed. Not unusual. Producing seed in our hatcheries has also been always been a little bit finicky. Not a guaranteed thing every time you spawn oysters that you're going to get larvae out the other side. But we started to have consistent problems around 2005, 2006. Another hatchery on the Oregon coast had problems at the same time, good friends of ours, so we were comparing notes, and they were struggling, we were struggling. At the same time, the Pacific oyster that we farm, which is non-native, it was introduced from Japan, It is naturalized in a few areas where it spawns and reproduces successfully. Willapa Bay is the main one, and a big part of the industry in Willapa Bay relied on that natural recruitment to seed their farms. That natural recruitment failed at the same time our 2 hatcheries failed. So there was a big seed shortage for the industry, and the media got on it. It was really quite a crisis on the industry. Early on, we thought it was a bacteria. It was a naturally occurring bacteria called Vibrio tubiaceae that does kill the oyster larvae, and it was very prevalent in the water at the time. We spent a lot of money designing filters to get that bacteria out of the water, only to find out after we did that the oyster larvae were still dying. And what we've learned since is that that bacteria is just a symptom of these changing seawater chemistries. That bacteria thrived in these low pH, high CO2 waters. So about the time this came into focus for us, 2008, Dr. Richard Feely, who's one of the leading scientists in the world on ocean acidification, he's based here for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in Seattle. He was the keynote speaker at our Shellfish Growers Conference. And he said, I've got some bad news for you. He said, I think I know what's causing your oyster larvae mortality. And he explained this ocean acidification phenomenon to us and said, oh, by the way, I've got some worse news for you, that because of the CO2 that's already absorbed by the Pacific Ocean, if you can convince the world to stop emitting CO2, this problem is going to get worse for you for the next 30 to 50 years. That water's already in the pipeline, coming your way. So, and it's going to get worse because we've obviously been emitting more and more CO2 over those years. So there's this big backlog of CO2 in the Pacific Ocean coming at us. So not very good news. Pretty somber day for the shellfish growers. And we've learned a lot since then, which I'll go on to explain, that's given us some signs of optimism that there's ways for us to adapt, but it's also given us the incentive, sort of as the canaries in the coal mine, one of the first industries to be impacted directly by this, to take advantage of opportunities like this and try to educate the broader public and policymakers. As Chris mentioned, I had a very unique opportunity this past summer to speak at the United Nations and educate diplomats that actually can make a difference, people that have some influence on CO2 emissions around the world, which was really a wonderful opportunity. And did the same in October. I was over in Vienna speaking at the International Atomic Energy Agency to a similar group audience on the same issues. So, that we're trying to take advantage of the opportunity to educate policymakers about this impact to our industry as well. And it seems to make a difference. It's one thing to have scientists stand up there and show you all the charts and try to explain what's happening, which is important, a very important part, but to actually have a practitioner that's being impacted by it deliver the message seems to be stronger yet. So lots of media attention to it, just because of this impact to the industry. Seattle Times, some people maybe have seen this. I'll pass this around. Seattle Times got a grant from the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, and they're doing a 3-month series on ocean acidification. It launched a couple months ago with a special insert in the Sunday Seattle Times that has really been a great tool. Just coincidentally, that showed up in the paper the day I was leaving for Vienna, and I got delayed at SeaTac on my way out. So I called the reporter, I know Craig Welch pretty well, and said, Craig, here's the deal. Here's the audience I'm going to speak to. Do you think you could get 100 of those in my hand before I get on the plane? And so they sent a reporter down from Seattle, and I took 100 of those with me to Vienna and passed them out, which is pretty cool. So here's what's happening as we've come to learn with our oyster larvae. So in the first 2 days of their life, so once what happens with oysters, clams, mussels, all of them reproduce the same way. They release sperm and eggs into the water. The sperm penetrates the egg. Fertilization happens externally in the water. And once that egg's fertilized, it doesn't have a skeleton. So the first thing it's got to do, it's got to build shell. So in the first 48 hours of its life, 90% of the weight that it puts on is shell. And it does that with energy from within the egg because it doesn't have a feeding mechanism yet either. So it's got to build its shell, and develop a feeding mechanism, all from energy within that egg within the first 48 hours. Well, what happens is if the carbonate ion saturation is too low in the water, it has to work extra hard to get those carbonate ions out of the water to build that shell, and it uses up all that energy. And so you can see the shell gets all deformed, and it doesn't complete the task, and it doesn't build its feeding mechanism, and it perishes. So that's why we were seeing in our hatchery, we were trying to figure out, in the first 48 hours is when we lost a lot of them. And if we got them to survive past 48 hours, they would hang in there, but they didn't do very well. They weren't very healthy. We didn't understand that. You know, we'd look under these animals are tiny. When that egg's fertilized, it's only 80 microns in size. So we look under our microscope in the hatchery, we'd look and say, yep, they're dead, but we didn't understand, you know, what had happened to them. And it wasn't until I was on the Ocean Acidification Blue Ribbon panel, and I was as we were developing our final report to the governor and to the legislature, I said, you know, we really need an AHA photo of oysters. I said, we've got the pteropod photo, you know, these planktonic snails with their shells dissolving, which everybody looks at and says, oh my God, that's bad, you know. But we didn't have that same photo for the oysters. So we got some time on the scanning electron microscope at the Oregon State University, and they produced these pictures for us. And this was an aha moment for us. We didn't have any idea what was happening to our shells until we saw these photos ourselves. And it was really, it was an eye-opener for us. And then the research that followed that's helped us understand what's going on in these first 48 hours has been really instrumental, because as I'll talk about a little bit later, now with monitoring we can treat our water. We have an automatic treatment system in the hatchery that injects sodium carbonate into the water and bumps the carbonate ion concentration up. So when the water's coming in and it's low, because we've got an upwelling event going on, we can bump that carbonate ion concentration up and get them all to look like the ones on the left. So it's given us a workaround by knowing that. So this is the feeding mechanism. It's called a vellum on these young planktonic oysters. So these are baby oysters, and that little ciliated arm there is called the vellum, and that's what it motates with, and that's what it feeds with. You can see just how important that appendage is in this video through the microscope, how critical it is for them moving around as well as feeding. So if they are unable to successfully develop their shell and build that mechanism, they're toast. So some of the things we've done to respond, you know, we've been very fortunate. We've got a very strong growers association that's really worked as an advocate for the industry, trying to help resolve our seed shortage, working with Congress and universities to try to secure funding and interest in doing research to help us. And it's also helped us make the links between other growers. So hatcheries are talking to other hatcheries, and we're all sharing successes and failures to try to help bring the industry along. This is our scientist, Benoit Udeline, at our hatchery. So one of the things we had to do is ramp up our monitoring. Well, it's not easy, actually, surprisingly, it's not easy to measure pH in seawater. You can't just buy a pH meter and stick the probe in the water and get an accurate reading in seawater. It's a very different situation than freshwater. So getting accurate pH readings has been challenging. In fact, the X Prize Foundation, some of you may have heard of that before. They're the ones who inspired private investment in space travel. You know, they put these big, you know, multi-million-dollar prizes out there to try to stimulate entrepreneurs to develop things that will be for the public good. They've launched a competition to develop a pH monitor for the ocean that's robust and accurate. So it's a couple $1 million competition that's going on right now to try to help on this ocean acidification issue, because you can't measure the changes in the ocean with our current tools conveniently. So they're trying to help us fix that. So we've been limited in the past to particularly for the aragonite saturation, we'd have to collect samples in beer bottles and ship them off to a lab to be analyzed. So this was always kind of fun for the guys at the hatchery. You know, I never had any problem generating the bottles, but then you had a little trouble getting them to collect them and fill them afterwards. But and then the other thing we got developed with some help from Senator Cantwell. She was able to secure some funding from Congress to put some very sophisticated monitoring in all of these hatcheries to help us try to adapt and understand the seawater that was coming our way. So with that money, we bought this very expensive monitor. It's called a Berkelator, after Burke Hales, the scientist who developed it. But it tells us real time what the CO2 levels are in the seawater, and it's turned out to be an absolutely invaluable tool. And then just some of the other monitoring equipment that we're using there. And then we've ramped up our research. You know, we've got a team of scientists in our hatchery that are working along all the time to improve our production, but they're very focused on the ocean acidification. We're generating a tremendous amount of data with all of this new equipment, and we don't really understand how to interpret it, make sense of that, so we're looking to the universities and others to help us do that. We're working on a lot of different water treatments, and that's saved our butt here recently. I mentioned how we've got these automated systems injecting sodium carbonate into the seawater to adjust the chemistry. That's been really important. And then just expanding our collaboration both with the universities and with the government as we're trying to find solutions. Breeding is another thing that looks like it's got potential for us. So we've had a selective breeding program for Pacific oysters since the mid-90s. It's been a publicly funded breeding program based at the Hatfield Marine Science Center in Oregon. There's a couple of families of oysters that have actually turned out to do better in these corrosive seawaters. So we've got some research money. The Oregon State Legislature's appropriated some money to look specifically at that to see if that's real, and if we can't try to help breed our way around the problem. I mentioned earlier that tailors have a hatchery over in Hawaii, and it has not been impacted by this situation. The upwelling doesn't occur there like it does here on the west coast of the United States, so that facility has not been impacted like we have here. So we've been able to increase our production capacity over there to offset losses that we've had here. We've got a big expansion going on there right now that'll go online next spring. We've also increased our hatchery capacity at our Quilcene hatchery on the Hood Canal. So just real quickly, what goes on there in the hatchery, you know, these animals are microscopic, so after the egg's fertilized, we rear them in these conical tanks, these continuous flow-through tanks with little very fine Nitex screen filters in them. All that brown haze are baby oysters that she's releasing into that tank. Same here. These are oysters that she's rinsing off an 80 micron screen that have just been fertilized. No artificial diet in the hatchery to feed these guys. So a big part of the work in our hatcheries is growing phytoplankton, different species of marine algae to feed the different stages of oyster larvae. So we have big greenhouses here at our hatchery in Washington. That's one of the reasons we went to Hawaii about 20 years ago, is to find a place that's easier in the wintertime to grow algae. Here we spend a lot of money on electricity and grow lights to grow algae in our hatchery. And then the water is cold that we're pumping into the hatchery, so the animals are dormant. So then we spend a bunch of money on diesel fuel to heat the seawater, to get the metabolism up on the oysters so they'll eat this food that we're fighting Mother Nature to grow. And that was when the light came on 20 years ago and said, you know, these things are tiny. We can put 20 million of them in a 6-pack beer cooler. Let's go someplace else in the world where it's warmer and easier to do this. So that's what we started doing, and it's worked out really well having that facility in Kona. And it's really helped us a lot now with this ocean acidification situation, because we've been able to boost production over there. That facility was already in place. We knew how to grow our oyster larvae over there, so we could just increase the size of it and produce more larvae there. So then I've already talked about the treatment system. It's interesting, you know, I mentioned earlier that aragonite saturation, they call that the omega value. If it's above 1, you can grow shell. If it's below 1, they dissolve. So we were initially, when we got this treatment system in the hatchery, we were shooting for that level of 1, thinking that's we need to get above that. When we were talking to our friends out at the Dungeness Bay hatchery on the Oregon coast, they said, you think 1's good, you should bump it up to 3 and see what happens. So we did that, and of course, it made all the difference in the world. And when you think about it, you know, it makes some sense, you know, that if you're close to 1, you're still struggling to build that shell. You can do it, but you're still using more energy to do it. You get it up to 3 and make it easy, you're going to use less of that lipid in your egg for shell development. You'll get your feeding mechanism. You'll be a hardier, bigger, hardier, healthy larvae at the end of that plankton period when you're going through metamorphosis to begin your life on the bottom. So it just it's been a learning curve for us, but that's what we're doing now. So I've also talked about this, how we've expanded our outreach and education you know, I put a lot of time into this at events like this, and this was actually speaking at the International Atomic Energy Agency this fall. We also have 2 full-time outreach and education staff. The company supports 2 people, one here in North Sound and one in South Sound, that are just out in the schools, in the classroom, doing tours on our farms and so on. And of course, they've added ocean acidification into their messaging with the school kids as well. We've been really fortunate here in Washington State to have some local elected officials that are have been very strong advocates for helping us resolve this situation. Governor Gregoire was the first. She picked up on this. It was part of our Washington State Shellfish initiative, which was an initiative we launched to implement a national shellfish initiative that was launched by NOAA in 2011 in an effort to grow shellfish aquaculture in the country. And so the Washington Shellfish Initiative included a number of things to try to advance shellfish aquaculture in the state, but one of the more visible ones was forming this ocean acidification blue ribbon panel that Governor Gregoire formed, and I served on that, and we delivered this report to the governor, and there was a big press event. Dr. Lubchenko, the head of NOAA, came out, and they had a big press event at the Seattle Aquarium, and it got a lot of national media. It's actually gotten a lot of attention throughout the world, because we were really one of the first governments, particularly a state government, definitely the first state government in the United States, really one of the first governments to step forward and say, we're going to do something about ocean acidification. And, you know, Governor Gregoire was challenged on that. She said, what can you possibly do as a state about ocean acidification when the problem is CO2 emissions throughout the world? You know, Washington State, our contribution to the CO2 emissions is something like 0.003 or something like that. It's a very small percentage of the world's CO2 emissions, and she said, well, we can lead. And that's exactly what she did. And it got a lot of attention internationally. This blue ribbon panel has gotten a lot of attention. At this, I'll talk more about this, but you know, Oregon and California didn't want to be left behind, so they recently signed an MOU with each other to basically do what Washington did and develop. They've put together a work group on ocean acidification and hypoxia, another problem that's caused with excess nutrients and upwelling off our coasts. And Washington is participating on that, so there's a major effort going on there. I just saw an email from Senator Ranker yesterday, and he said there's legislation moving in the Maine legislature right now to pass a bill to basically set up an ocean acidification panel in Maine to start addressing the problem in Maine as well. So it's catching on around the country as people are learning about the issue. That ocean acidification report, I'll show you a website here at the end, you can write it down if you're interested, is more than just the report with 42 recommendations. There are several appendices to it that are just full of really good information. So we had a science panel that worked parallel to the blue ribbon panel and put together all the science on our current knowledge about ocean acidification here in Washington and how it's affecting our state's resources. That's what this is. There was also appendix that talked about our state's legal and policy options for dealing with ocean acidification, and then the feasibility, another report in there talked about the feasibility of the different measures that were being put forward to actually be implemented. So a lot of good resources. The governor, after she got the blue ribbon panel, she did an executive order to implement the 42 recommendations that were in there, and in her parting budget, she recommended $3.3 million be appropriated to work on this ocean acidification issue and implement those recommendations. Governor Inslee, as he came in, he embraced that in his budget as well. And as we all know, the legislature is definitely struggling for resources, so coming up with a new program and $3.3 million was probably not going to happen. We were very fortunate, though, at the end of the debate at the legislative session when it adjourned last June, they appropriated, the House and the Senate agreed to appropriate $1.8 million of that 3.3 to create a new ocean acidification center at the University of Washington. So that's a good thing. So this is there was also this bill that was passed that created a new council in Governor Inslee's office to essentially carry on the work of the blue ribbon panel. But now in Governor Inslee's office, I've also been asked to serve on this new council. We've met once. We've got another meeting coming up here in February. I'm kind of excited about it. I was a little disappointed because I think there's only 3 of us from the blue ribbon panel that transitioned to this new council. But the new council, the first meeting, We have a number of state agency directors, Director of Ecology, Director of Fish and Wildlife, the Commissioner of Public Lands, Commissioner Goldmark are all on this panel, all taking it very seriously. But there was a whole group of new stakeholders, fishermen and different people that weren't part of the Blue Ribbon panel that are now getting educated and getting really engaged on the issue. So I think it's actually a good thing that there wasn't so much overlap with the Blue Ribbon panel, because you're getting a whole bunch of new leaders in the state excited and educated about this issue and motivated to do something about it. So I'm encouraged about where that's going to go. This is the Ocean Acidification Center that was created by the legislature for $1.8 million. They were given 5 priority actions, and a big focus there, frankly, as you look down this list, is to do things that will help our industry adapt and survive, because we're the ones at this point that are seeing the biggest effect. But it's also to try to do work to understand what the implications are for the other marine resources in Washington State as well that are important besides just the shellfish industry. So good stuff. So just real quickly, I threw some pictures up here of my clam farm in Samish Bay, just so you understand beyond my work for Taylor's that I've got a personal dog in this fight, and that's one of the reasons I'm as passionate about this as I am. So far, baby clams, our ability to produce clam seed hasn't been affected like oysters have. Different shellfish use different types of calcium carbonate to build their shells. And clams use a form that apparently isn't as vulnerable as the baby oysters. So we've been fortunate in that regard so far, but I think the clams are maybe potentially going to be affected in another way that concerns me, and I'll talk about that in a second. So there's my farm out there in the middle of Samish Bay. Here's a picture of it at low tide. At high tide, this is normally under about 10 feet of water. But I grow clams under 4-foot wide predator nets in rows that are roughly 1,000 feet long, and then we've mechanized the farming. We've had some fun with it. So this is a tulip bulb harvester that I got from the Rusin family, and have adapted to dig my clams. And then I have a landing craft for a boat, and I have a tractor that I use to work on the farm and put my nets in and clean my nets and so on. So very much like a terrestrial farm, but I just do it, when the tide's low. I go out and have about a 3.5 hour window to work on my farm on a good low tide day. With that machine, because it's so efficient, I can go out with my wife and my kids, and in that 3.5 hour time frame, we can dig 7,000 to 10,000 pounds of clams with that machine. So started out as a hobby. It's gotten a little bit more than a hobby, but I still, because we've mechanized it, I'm still able to do it with my family. And we have one person we hire part-time that helps us out there, but it's a lot of fun. It's kind of my therapy. That's how I keep my sanity from all the policy work I do, is go out and get muddy and produce some clams. But those are my baby clams that I plant. So basically I put those nets in first, and the mesh of the net is about 1/4 inch, and the clam seed's small enough that it'll go through the net. So after we get the nets in, we plant the clam seed, and they go down through the net. And 3 years later, we pull the nets off and dig clams, not with a rake like that, but with a machine. Taylor's grow about 4 million pounds of clams a year on their farms, and that's how they're all dug, is with a rake like that. So hundreds of people on their hands and knees digging clams. They've adapted, they've taken my technology with a machine. Now they're growing clams in rows in Samish Bay as well, and they built a machine to do the same thing, and hired my son actually to run it, so he's got a full-time job out of it. I lost one of my employees, but glad to see he's got a full-time job with it. That's a good deal. So one of the things that I am challenged by in Samish Bay is Dungeness crab predation. So that's one of my biggest predators on my clams, and one of the things that's happening with ocean acidification is that crab shells are getting harder and clam shells are getting thinner. So my clams are going to be more vulnerable as this game continues. So this is just from 1 square foot under one of my rows. These are the crab that came out of that 1 square foot. Those are the clams that are still alive, and those are all the ones they've eaten. So this is just a photo of bottom cultured oysters. This is traditionally how the industry has farmed oysters here on the West Coast, where we grow clusters of oysters and shuck the meats out of them and sell the shucked meats in jars like that. The industry in the recent years has been transitioning to producing single oysters for the half-shell trade, and I'll show some pictures of that. Those of you who have been down to our plant on Chuckanut there at low tide, this is what you see out in front of the plant. The ground there is too muddy to support an oyster crop. Oysters have to live on top of the ground. A clam lives down in the ground and extends a siphon to the surface to feed. An oyster has to stay on top of the surface. It doesn't have a siphon like a clam, so it sits on top of the ground and just gapes its shell open, pumps the water through. So if it sinks into the mud, it suffocates and dies. So the east side of Samish Bay is real muddy, so we grow the oysters up on these long lines to keep them up out of the mud. This is down in southern Puget Sound. This is what we do when we're producing single oysters. It's a whole different process. So oysters, at the end of their plankton phase, they go through a metamorphosis and begin their life on the bottom, and they secrete a cement and they glue themselves onto something for the rest of their life. From an evolution standpoint, they've learned to glue themselves onto oyster shells, because if you find an oyster shell, that means oysters have survived there in the past. You've got the best chance of surviving as well. So we save all of our old oyster shells in the processing plant, put them into plastic mesh bags, into fiberglass tanks with heated seawater, introduce the larvae from the hatchery. They glue onto those shells in those bags. After about 6 months, we break those bags open and spread the shells out on the bottom, and that's how we seed a crop to produce the clusters that you saw there and there. So that started as a big piece of old oyster shell with a bunch of baby oysters attached to it that grows up into this flower of oysters that they then comes back through the processing plant, and the shuckers just work their way around the clusters, cutting the meats out of the oysters. When we're growing single oysters, it's a different game where we take that old shell, grind it up, sift the shell fragments on a sieve, so every shell fragment's only a few hundred microns in size, and there's only room for one baby oyster larvae to attach to each little shell chip. And then we have big nursery systems to rear these babies in to get them up to about the size of my thumbnail before we take them out to the farm and plant them out on either directly on the bottom, or in cases where we have predators, whether it be Dungeness crab, or this is actually a farm in Dungeness Bay, California, where they have bat rays that will eat the oysters. So you have to put the oysters inside these plastic mesh bags to keep the predators from eating them. This is in Samish Bay. This is a culture system we've developed in recent years to produce a very different oyster. It's still a Pacific oyster, but when we grow them in these bags that have floats on them, what happens is the tide comes in, and there's a float on the bottom of each one of these bags. The bag flips up. As the tide goes out, it flips back down. So the bag's in constant motion, up and down, up and down, up and down. Those oysters are tumbling inside the bag, and it takes all the fluting off the shell, and it changes the shape of the shell and gives it a really nice deep cup. And it gives it a hard bill, so when we process it, we don't chip the bills, the liquor doesn't drain out of the shell, and it gives you this beautiful oyster with this deep cup, so when you're eating it raw in the half shell, you take the top shell off, and you've just got this little round ball of meat inside the shell. So we call those our Shigoku oyster, and a trademark name for that is just a regular Pacific oyster, but when we grow them this special way, we call them a Shigoku, and this is how we sell them in these cedar boxes. And Shigoku in Japanese means the ultimate oyster. So. And then the clam culture I mentioned already, most of it is just done directly on the beach, where we blanket farm the whole beach and dig them by hand. Some people will grow them in bags as well, with some substrate in the bags, and then when you come time to harvest, you just pick the bag up out of the ground and leave it on the bottom and let the sand wash out of it, and then you pick the bag up and you just have clams. So one of the things around clam culture that we haven't really investigated here, that has been researched in Maine, on the east coast of the United States, they don't have the same upwelling phenomenon that we do, but the acidity of the bays is impacted by nutrient runoff coming off the shore. There's a lot of development on the east coast and a lot of nutrients that come into the estuaries that bloom algae, and when that algae dies and decomposes, it increases the CO2 levels. So it essentially has the same effect as ocean acidification is having on us with our upwelling events. Well, what they've learned in Maine is it changes the pH of the mud. So when these baby clams end their plankton cycle and they recruit down and settle into the mud to dig in, the shells are dissolving and it's killing the clams. So what they're doing to get around that is they're adding crushed shell to the mud to change the chemistry of the mud and buffer the pH of the mud so that the juvenile clams, when they recruit to the mud, the shells don't dissolve. This is an effect we haven't looked at here, and I'm really curious to get that research done to see because we've noticed some of our more productive areas where we have natural recruitment of clams haven't been productive for years. And I'm wondering if it's that same phenomenon that we're just seeing a change in the mud, in the chemistry of the mud as well. Mussel culture, we do this by rafts, so deep water. We don't do this in Samish Bay up here, but we've got 2 farms in Totten Inlet and southern Puget Sound. Emily Carrington, a University of Washington scientist that's based out here at Friday Harbor, has been doing her research on the effects of ocean acidification on mussels. And what she's finding is that in a high CO2 warmer ocean, that the byssal threads, the hairy threads that the mussels use to hang on to pilings, or in our case our rafts, the byssal threads get weaker in a high CO2 ocean and the shells get thinner. So that we already have problems on our mussel rafts with what we call sloughing, where the mussels get too heavy for the byssal threads to hold on, and the mussels just start to drop off the farm and fall to the bottom. And what she's telling, her research is telling me, or telling us, is that problem is just going to get worse for us as the seawater chemistry continues to change. Geoduck culture is another one, fairly new to our industry. We started growing geoducks in the early 1990s. We plant the baby geoduck in these nursery tubes. So this is a 6-inch diameter PVC pipe that has a predator net over the top of it. The baby geoducks look just like the adults. They can't get all the meat inside the shell, so they're really vulnerable to predators. Just about anything can eat them at that stage of their life, particularly when they're shallow in the substrate. And they're also prone to drying out at low tide. So that's why the bulk of the geoduck populations in Puget Sound are subtidal. They live down deep. But we've kind of extended that range a bit by creating these miniature tide pools with the predator protection over them. We can plant 3 baby geoducks in each one of these tubes. When the tide goes out, it creates this tide pool that keeps the seed wet, and then that keeps the predators from eating them. After about a year and a half, the geoducks are down about 2 feet deep in the substrate. We can pull the tube off and reuse it for another crop. And they're down beyond drying out and predators getting them. And then about 4 years later, we'll go through and harvest, and then we'll start the cycle again. But one of the things we've noticed, interestingly, is we've struggled for years trying to produce the geoduck seed. That's been a real bottleneck in growing our industry. And it's because the seed is so fragile in the hatchery. Every time we would handle it or move it in the nurseries, we'd have a big mortality event behind. There'd be all these dead geoducks laying on the surface. And it's because the shells were so thin, we'd damage the geoducks when we handled them. Well, this past year, with our automated water treatment system, bumping up the aragonite saturation in the hatchery water, all of a sudden the geoduck shells are hard as a rock. And we're not having the mortalities in our seed like we've been having forever. So that tells me that ocean acidification is probably affecting the wild geoduck. So the state is having problems. There's over 4 million pounds of geoducks that are harvested off of subtidal beds every year from the wild beds in the state. And the babies are not recruiting to those beds like they have historically. So the production is dropping on those natural beds. I'm telling the Commissioner of Public Lands, I'm saying, you know, based on what I've observed in our hatchery, this is something you need to be looking at, because some of the lowest pH, highest CO2 water, the most corrosive water is at depth. It's that water that upwells up into our hatchery that causes us problem. Well, that's where his baby geoduck are trying to get established, is down there in this very corrosive environment. So they need to be looking at this effect on the wild harvest population as well. This is our geoduck nursery, a big floating nursery in Totten Inlet. So these are all sand-lined trays. This whole unit just lowers down into the water. There's 5 of these units with multiple trays in them, and these are all the baby geoducks sitting there. You can see all the siphons sticking out of the sand underwater there. So we talked about that already. So that's our hatchery on the Hood Canal, and we've already talked about how that's being impacted. There's the tanks where we grow larvae in big tanks, as well as those flow-through tanks I showed you earlier, and more pictures of the algae culture there. So this is the hatcheries on the West Coast. This is all the facilities that are producing seed. There's not that many of them. You can see our hatchery, Taylor's hatchery here on the Hood Canal, our nursery I mentioned in Northern California, and our Hawaii facility. This Goose Point hatchery has gotten a lot of attention in the press. This is a company that's based in Willapa Bay, and because they couldn't get seed, they went and started a hatchery over in Hilo, and that got a lot of national press attention. People always ask me when I talk about our hatchery in Hawaii, are you Goose Point? You know, because they've seen that news story. That's gotten a lot of coverage. Coast Seafood is another big hatchery in Quilcene Bay, so near ours, but Coast hasn't experienced the same problems that we have at our hatchery, and it's just a very different chemistry. Even though you can almost throw a rock over the peninsula and hit the hatchery, Dabob Bay is a fjord within the larger Hood Canal fjord, and the oceanography is unique there, and this upwelled water from the coast works its way into the Hood Canal, up over the sill into Dabob Bay, and settles into Dabob Bay. So at the bottom of Dabob Bay is some of the most corrosive water they've measured anywhere in the world's oceans. But in the summertime, as long as we keep a gentle south wind, that corrosive water stays deep. And we have two intakes at our hatchery. We have a deep one and we have a shallow one. And what we've come to learn with the monitoring equipment is stay out of the deep water in the summertime. That water will be a pH of 7.5 and a CO2 level of 1200. And just 70 feet higher up at the surface, the pH will be 8.2 and the CO2 will be 390, and just the same as atmospheric. So the monitoring has been absolutely critical to learn all that. So, and the Lummi tribe, interestingly, they have a hatchery, a smaller hatchery up here in Bellingham Bay, while their intake is in Lummi Bay. So something unique that they did a number of years ago is they built saltwater ponds. They built a big dike out into Lummi Bay to create saltwater ponds to grow salmon in. And it didn't work for salmon because those ponds got too warm and it would kill the baby salmon. But the ponds still exist, and the intake for their hatchery is in those ponds. And they have not experienced the same problems that we have. We think one of the reasons may be is that the plankton bloom in that pond and change the CO2 levels, because you get the phytoplankton will naturally adjust those CO2 levels and allow them to get better water in the hatchery. So it's a treatment system we're looking at. The Oregon hatcheries learned the same thing. With the monitoring, they've learned, you know, they used to come into the hatchery at 8 o'clock in the morning and turn the pumps on and go to work, fill the tanks and go to work. Well, the monitoring equipment, they've learned if they wait until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, let the phytoplankton and the eelgrass photosynthesize and change the seawater chemistry in the bay. If they wait till afternoon, they can get much better water into their tanks. So just micromanaging like that, their hatchery and our hatchery have been able to recover a lot of our production. So these are the two that I mentioned earlier, our hatchery and the Whiskey Creek hatchery, that have been most impacted. Another part of the new center at UW is going to be working on modeling to be able to help predict where these ocean acidification events are going to be occurring in the future. Might be helpful for us as far as locating new facilities so we can avoid some of this bad water in the future. Now, the next place we're going as far as an industry, the next steps are to look at our remote setting facilities where we're doing the seed setting. So this is our facility in Humboldt Bay. So we've figured out how to produce the oyster larvae in Quilcene pretty successfully now. Then we ship it off to California to take it through the metamorphosis process, where it comes out of the free floating stage and is attaching to these little shell fragments, and they're not making it. So we get all this good larvae out of the hatchery, but they're dying as we try to take them through metamorphosis. What we're coming to realize is Humboldt Bay is very subjected to these upwelling events too, and we're getting bad seawater in at a stage when they're still very vulnerable. So we're going to add water treatment systems to our setting system this year, as well as monitoring there, so we can do the same thing essentially that we're doing at our hatchery. Same thing, this is not our facility, but there's tons of these all around the Northwest where companies basically have put in fiberglass tanks. They take their shell bags, put them in those tanks, and then they order oyster larvae from the hatcheries. Well, this is still a very vulnerable stage, so we're trying to transition the industry to where more people are monitoring the seawater and potentially doing treatments here at their larvae tanks before they set to try to get better survival on their seeds. So. And as conditions get worse, so this is where we produce all our baby single oysters. I mentioned the different process there. So these are all your little thumbnail size oysters that are growing in these nursery systems that we've got both in Humboldt Bay and in near Shelton. As the seawater conditions get worse, we're anticipating that we're going to have problems producing our juveniles. I mean, over time, over the next 30 to 50 years, it's going to start affecting our juveniles and our adults as well. So we've got a little bit of reprieve right now while we figured out how to produce seed, but we're not expecting that's going to go on forever. So these are a couple of the websites for information. That the Washington State Ocean Acidification webpage is a great resource. That's where that Blue Ribbon Panel report is at. And then the Ocean Acidification Center has got a lot of good resources as well, a lot of facts about ocean acidification, and there's my contact information as well if you have questions or want to follow up with anything. But I think I've talked long enough here at this point. I'm happy to take some questions.
So I have, for the question.
Chris wants you to use the mic here.
Can I ask?
This is more contamination. And I read somewhere that China, which gets most of the geoducks population, that they were saying it was hundreds of times more with mercury. And they didn't want to buy the geoducks. Of course, they have their own industry. And I wondered if it was a political kind of thing, because what is the mercury, because the testing here said we haven't seen those results.
Right. So it's arsenic, not mercury, that's been the issue. Yeah, and yeah, we're dealing with a ban in China right now. They've stopped importing all shellfish, not just geoduck, but all shellfish from the west coast here right now, from northern California up to Siberia. Essentially, they've closed it down, and it came from one shipment of geoduck that was harvested north of Tacoma. It's a wild harvest geoduck track. Harvest from Poverty Bay, and then there was a PSP sample that tested high as well from Ketchikan, Alaska. So some geoduck, another wild harvest geoduck shipment from Ketchikan that were both over China's standards. So they said stop shipping from what they call Area 67, which is unfortunate that was the harvest area designation on the export certification form, because that happens to be the entire coast. So instead of these two isolated areas getting closed down, because of the information that was on the export certificates, they closed the whole west coast down. And we're trying to get that reversed and get the rest of the areas opened up. They've also done follow-up testing to show that those areas, the area there in Poverty Bay, none of the state samples showed that it was in excess of the Chinese standards. So we think their test was either an anomaly or that there was a mistake made in translation from Chinese to U.S., that units got, something got screwed up in translation, or that it was, instead of inorganic, it was total arsenic, which would account for the number that they reported. So we're all trying to get to the bottom of how they've got this number that they got and see if we can't get it turned around. Well, so a lot of people have suggested that it might be a political retaliation for something the United States did. And Senator Cantwell and Congressman Kilmer met with the U.S. Trade Representative early on when this first emerged, and he said he didn't think so. That if they were trying to make a political statement, there's a lot of other things that go from China to the U.S. Geoduck is small potatoes. If they wanted to make a statement, they wouldn't just do geoduck. It would be something more significant. And also, they just don't have a history of stopping imports of U.S. seafood. It's never been an issue before, so he didn't think it was a trade issue. So we're going on the assumption that China thinks they have a legitimate public health issue and trying to get the responses that they want. We'll see. We hope to get it turned around. Chinese New Year's is a huge market for us, and that's the end of January. So we're really trying to get this resolved in the next week or so we can ship to that market. There's a question in the way back there.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk. My question is way less scientific. I was just wondering where you sell your clams specifically, and also if you ever allow visitors to come see your clam farm, or if Taylor has tours or things, just for people who want to bring maybe a young person and see more.
Absolutely, yeah. Taylors do tours. I'm happy to take people out of my farm. It's not very convenient. My farm is in the middle of Samish Bay, and we go before the tide drops, and we come back after the tide comes back. So it's usually a 7-hour beach-to-beach excursion. We go for the day when we go, and so it's not real convenient to take people out, although I'm happy to do that. But tailors do tours all the time. It's a lot more convenient there because you can just walk out in front of the plant. As I mentioned, we have an outreach and education coordinator, Nicole Hopper, who works out of Samish. So if you get a hold of me, I'll give you my card. If you get a hold of me, I can get you her contact information, and she'd be happy to take you or your family out for a tour down there anytime. And she also goes out in the classrooms. I know she speaks in a lot of classrooms here in Whatcom County as well. This time of year, it's not a lot of fun because our low tides are in the middle of the night. So not real conducive to taking classrooms out this time of year, but we go out to the classrooms and do talks in the classrooms too. So yeah, follow up with me. I'll get you some information there. Yeah.
Are other countries affected the way we have been in this state or in this country?
Well, so other countries are definitely being affected by ocean acidification. I think, we've probably been the most visible shellfish industry that's been impacted, but they're seeing the same effects. They've done some research with the Sydney rock oyster in Australia. They're having effects from ocean acidification on it. I just came back from New Zealand. We just had a workshop with the New Zealand industry down there, and they're seeing some effects that could be explained by ocean acidification, but they don't have a monitoring program in that country, so they don't know. So through that exchange, they've come to realize the importance of getting a baseline of information on monitoring, so they're going to initiate a monitoring program down there. But it tends to be, where the effects seem to be seen right now is on the west coasts of continents where you have upwelling phenomenon. So in the Baltic Sea, off of Chile, here on the west coast, northwest coast of North America are areas where this CO2 that's been absorbed by the ocean is coming to the surface and having an immediate effect. And I didn't show, I should have used some of Dr. Feely's slides, but the effects are being felt first towards the poles. Colder water absorbs CO2 better, so the issues are migrating from the poles towards the equators. So that's where you're going to see the effects first, is up in the colder waters, and then it will gradually move towards the equator. So. We got one over here.
Help me correct my faulty memory. Years ago, I thought I read something about the clams and oysters and shellfish in general, other than the ones that are raised for eating, filtering water in bays. We live up in Birch Bay. Mm-hmm. And I thought there was a figure about how many liters or gallons of water shellfish filters out.
Yeah.
What impact does that have on our environment up here if, in fact, the shellfish population does dwindle way down?
Well, it's a really great question, actually. So shellfish, if everyone heard the question, shellfish provide a variety of ecosystem services, not the least of which is filtration. So a single Pacific oyster, adult Pacific oyster, in the summertime when the water's warm, will filter up to 65 gallons of water a day through its gills. So they're major water processors. In the Chesapeake Bay, where this issue has really come to light, the Chesapeake Bay used to produce about a third of the country's oysters. And today, because of disease and pollution and overharvest, they produce less than 1% of the nation's oysters. And they estimate that population of oysters prior to exploitation could filter the entire volume of Chesapeake Bay once every 3 days, would go through the gills of the oysters. So incredible filtration capacity, and they kept that water clear. If you go to the Chesapeake Bay today, the water looks brown and muddy, and it's not mud, it's algae. It's being unconsumed by the filter feeders the bivalves that used to be there, the oysters that used to be there. And that's wreaked havoc with that ecosystem. So because of those algae blooms, the sunlight can no longer penetrate through the water to get to the eelgrass. And the eelgrass is a very valuable nursery habitat. So the eelgrass is disappearing because of all this algae that's blocking the sunlight in the water column. So they're spending millions and millions of dollars every year of public taxpayer dollars to try to restore the oyster populations to Chesapeake Bay for that filtration capacity to remove the nitrogen that's causing the algae blooms and all those other effects. So same thing, if ocean acidification starts to diminish the number of bivalves and filter feeders out there in the estuary, you're going to start to see similar effects potentially that they've seen in the Chesapeake Bay. It's not quite fair to make that across-the-board comparison. Chesapeake Bay is a shallow estuary, Puget Sound is deep, but in some of the shallower areas of Puget Sound, it could make a huge difference, like Samish Bay, so it could have an effect. It's a great question. In the back here.
So yeah, I really appreciated your talk too. I spent most of my summers on Samish Island, North Beach.
Nice.
Not too far from Blau's Oyster House, but I have something I've noticed in my lifetime. What has happened to our limpets? I don't see limpets anywhere anymore. I used to be able to see limpets on the rocks on the beach.
Oh, limpets.
Limpets, yeah.
Limpets, yeah.
Limpets, yeah. What's happened to that? Do you know?
That's a good question. The question is what's happened to limpets. So do people know what limpets are? It's not a bivalve because it's only got one shell. Yeah, they're conical shaped and they suck onto the rocks. They're grazers. They graze on the algae that lives on the rocks and stuff. And so he's noticed in his lifetime a change in the limpet population, and that could well be. I've not heard that. I don't know that. I guess I've never really paid that close of attention. I don't see them on my farm. They're on a rocky substrate. So most of my time in the salt water is spent on a sandy substrate where I wouldn't be seeing limpets naturally. But if people live on rocky beaches, has anyone else made that same observation? I know Justin Taylor, who was third generation Taylor. He passed away here just recently at just after his 90th birthday, and he was definitely one of my mentors. I really enjoyed Justin's wisdom. And I've tried to carry Justin's mission forward. The last 20 years of Justin's life were spent trying to get policymakers' attention to very dramatic changes that he's observed in his lifetime in southern Puget Sound, where he's worked all his life, every day out on the water. Down there, the shore crabs have disappeared. And Justin said, where have the flounder gone? Where have the shore crab gone? These are things that Justin saw in abundance as a child that are no longer there. And it's tied to something we're doing to this ecosystem. Whether it's the chemistry changes, South Sound, it's more likely tied to the eutrophication. So we've got a huge amount of nutrients that go into southern Puget Sound. It's kind of a unique body of water because you got the Tacoma Narrows. So all those inlets and fingers of southern Puget Sound have to go out through the Tacoma Narrows, and it's a choke point. So all those nutrients that come into South Sound just bloom algae like it's going out of style. We can grow oysters today in half the time that it took us 15 years ago because of the abundance of food. It's amazing. It grows shellfish better than any other area I've seen around the world just because of the amount of phytoplankton down there. But it causes us problems when we get too much of it. It's changed that ecosystem, and it's affecting a lot of other critters just besides the shellfish. So we're definitely, man is definitely having an impact on the ocean. People thought for years this vast body of water, we can't possibly impact it. It's where we dispose of everything. People haul garbage out and dump garbage out there, and all of our sewage treatment plants discharge out there. And we've gotten better with our sewage treatment plants about how we treat that water and remove pollutants from it. But there's still a lot that goes out. We take the pathogens out, things that will make us sick, but we don't deal with a lot of the chemicals, the pharmaceuticals, the personal care products, all those chemicals that go into things that we use on our bodies and in our bodies, pass right through most of the sewage treatment plants and go out into the estuary, and we're just starting to learn what some of the effects of those things are.
Did I understand in the actual farms, beyond the nurseries, they're also injecting some sodium carbonate on the incoming tides to try to manage the pH?
Yeah, no, we're not. Not on the farms. Just in the hatchery in a building where we can do that efficiently and control it. Yeah. There's been a lot of discussion as we deal with ocean acidification about whether you could do something on that scale, add something to the ocean at the scale you need to change the chemistry back. And anybody that looks at that with any scientific background just says it's just not even practical. You can't. The one area that people are considering it is if you've got a very valuable resource in an estuary where you might be able to create a refugia to protect that resource, then it might be practical on a smaller scale in a localized nature. Or for example, one of the recommendations from the Blue Ribbon Panel is to look at using eelgrass restoration and macroalgae or seaweed farming to help mitigate the effects of ocean acidification. It's one of the things that we're looking at. I think I showed some pictures from my farm. We get a lot of macroalgae that grows on the nets. When you put a hard substrate out there in that nutrient-rich environment, the algae will grow on it. Once you give it something to attach to, it grows well, and then you have nutrients coming from the clams themselves that help feed that algae. So I want to look at a system to harvest that algae and do something useful with it. Either take it up to the dairymen in the watershed and use it as organic fertilizer. We have a lot of organic dairies now. So see if I can't, it's a nice form of what they call ecosystem-based management, where we can let those nutrients come into the watershed, capture them, and get them out of there before they cause complications, and take them back up into the watershed and do something useful with them. It's actually back to your question earlier. It's kind of interesting. This is another model we're trying to get implemented here. Shellfish are really effective nutrient mitigators. So as algae comes into, or nutrients come into the ecosystem and bloom that algae, shellfish eat that algae and use the energy of it to build their body mass. And then when we harvest the shellfish, we're taking those nutrients out of the system. So it's actually a net nitrogen removal when you grow shellfish. And we would qualify for nitrogen trading credits, actually, as a mitigator for nitrogen pollution. And there's a great model for this in Sweden, where this small town in Sweden, on a fjord, the nitrogen from their sewage treatment plant was causing environmental problems in the fjord. And rather than spending millions of dollars to put nitrogen scrubbers in the sewage treatment plant to remove the nitrogen, instead they located a mussel farm in the fjord. So they let the nutrients come, bloom the algae, catch them with the mussels, take the mussels up, and they've developed a method to make poultry feed out of the mussels and also to compost it and make terrestrial fertilizer. So take those nutrients back up into the watershed and use them again, and then let them come back down and catch them and take them back up and use them again. It's kind of a cool model. So we're trying to we've actually got some pilots going here in Washington State. The Puget Sound Restoration Fund, a nonprofit group, has done that in Quartermaster Harbor on Vashon Island and in Bud Inlet in South Sound. They've put in some mussel rafts and are trying to quantify that and see if that might be a tool we could use here too.
I was wondering, do you know if the fish farmers have had a problem with their fish forming bone because of the acidification?
I'm not aware of that. At this point, I don't know that the fish farms are engaged on the ocean acidification issue. We're getting the wild fisheries more engaged, trying to educate them about the impacts to the food chain that the fish that they're harvesting rely on. So Trident to step forward. They've been at a number of conferences with me. They're paying attention. So more and more you're starting to see the wild fisheries engage on it, but I haven't seen the fish farms that concerned as yet.
I was just wondering, after your presentation, what is your personal favorite meal?
Well, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I still love shellfish of all types. I don't know. It's partly because of my age. I think pan-fried oysters are still one of my favorites. Probably the worst for me, but I still love them.
You can't beat that. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for coming. We appreciate your help.